heroes are usually made in wartime, or at least in a time of crisis. Some years back, I found myself reading some Medal of Honor citations. Somebody else ever done that? Probably not too many. But Randy has, if you were here. But it's neat to read the citations. That's the account, the story that tells why this person got a Medal of Honor. And there's some fascinating stories in there, but there's also some that just kind of have a similar theme. And as you go back to particularly the Second World War, Korea, and even Vietnam, one of the common themes you see there is somebody would be awarded this medal because they threw themselves on a live hand grenade or explosive in order to protect their companions. And obviously that was almost always given posthumously. Somebody would throw themselves on a hand grenade in order to shield their friends, perhaps in a bunker or something, from being killed by that explosion. And certainly we can affirm that is a heroic act, deserving of recognition. Well, in a very real way, Jesus also can be considered a hero. But he calls himself the Good Shepherd. Here in John 10, Jesus, as we saw last week, already began to describe himself in terms of the sheep and shepherd relationship. Though, as we saw in verse 7, he described himself as the door. And in that he's describing how he offers provision and protection to his sheep. But now Jesus, here in verse 11, is going to describe himself as the Good Shepherd. And what's going to characterize the Good Shepherd is that very act of self-sacrifice. And so as we consider Jesus here, he's speaking of himself as the Good Shepherd, as the one we should follow, the one that we should believe in. He's going to give us a little bit of glimpse inside his own mind, his own perspective of himself. He's going to do that by showing us why he does what he does. Why does Jesus sacrifice himself for the sheep? Well, Jesus gives us 3 reasons here in John 10, verses 11 through 21. He gives us 3 reasons why he sacrifices himself for the sheep. So we're going to consider today these 3 reasons. The first reason is found in verses 11 through 13. 11 through 13. He says in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now, this is the first time he said, I'm the good shepherd. And remember, the context here, in the end of this section, we'll see the mention of the man born blind, John 9. Okay? And this immediately follows that. And what Jesus is doing is he's contrasting himself, saying, you've got thieves and robbers out there who are trying to lead you astray. But I'm the good shepherd. And so what he's doing is he's talking about the religious leaders that would point them away from believing in Jesus. That would point them in the direction of saying, no, don't believe Jesus is Messiah. He's not. They were jealous of Jesus. They hated him. And Jesus is contrasting himself with them. And what the contrast he's making is saying, I care for you. I love and care for you. And I am a shepherd that is good, that is going to shepherd you and give you what is best for you. These others don't do that. And so he's going to say here, I'm the good shepherd. And here's how you know it. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Now, As we talked some last week, the idea of a shepherd was a common one. It was something people were familiar with in that culture. Remember, David himself was a shepherd. And there's also passages in the Old Testament prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, even Isaiah, that talk about shepherds and the leaders of Israel as shepherds. But shepherds were not characterized as giving their lives for their sheep. Like, most shepherds didn't die in the line of duty. That wasn't common. Though we do remember David kind of risked his life. Remember, he said, "I've killed the lion and the bear with my sling." So obviously there was some danger involved in that. But it wasn't normal for the shepherd to die in the line of duty. But it was perhaps what we would call an occupational hazard. It might happen. But also consider Jesus saying, "I lay down my life for the sheep." Would a shepherd, perhaps, putting himself in front of the lion or the bear, or as he'll say in a minute, the wolves, is him dying, fighting the wolf, going to help the sheep? Right? Because the wolf might kill the shepherd, but then he's going to go after the sheep also and scatter them, and they will die in the wilderness. So Jesus isn't simply saying, hey, I just using this imagery here. He's talking about something very specific. He's using the imagery of sheep and shepherds, but he's saying something very specific here about what he, as the good shepherd, is going to do. And he's going to develop this concept throughout the rest of these verses we look at today. He's going to give his life on behalf of the sheep. What Jesus is doing here is he's painting this as this is the responsibility of the shepherd. The responsibility of the shepherd is to risk his life, to protect the sheep. And as the good shepherd, his responsibility is in fact to give his life on behalf of the sheep. So what we see is the first reason Jesus does this is he is the good shepherd. It's his duty or responsibility to do this. But very quickly we see in verses 12 and 13, he contrasts the good shepherd with, we might say, the not so good shepherd, right? Verse 12. But a hireling, or we could say a hired hand, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. So he says, a hired hand, and he characterizes and describes him quite a bit here. He is not the shepherd. He does not own the sheep. Right? He doesn't have anything a whole lot invested. He's just being hired to do this. He leaves the sheep. When he sees the wolf coming, he's like, I'm out of here, man. I'm not facing off with a wolf. So he says, I'm out of here. And the result is the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The point is, the wolf catches some sheep to kill them, and then the others scatter. And like I said, if the sheep scatter and live in the wilderness, they won't make it long. The wolves or something else will eventually find them. And then we're told why this is, which is pretty evident. Verse 13. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. He's just hired to do the job, right? How much money can you give someone to make them sacrifice their life? Can't give me any money for that, right? I'm not going to give my life for money. And so that's all it is to these hirelings. It's just, it's a pay. If the sheep die, whatever, I don't want to die. So he's contrasting himself, saying, hey, listen, I'm giving my life for the sheep. But guess what? There's others, they're not going to give their lives for you. They don't care about you. And the implication here, which is pretty obvious, is that's the religious leaders. They may have responsibility to watch over you and to shepherd you, but they're not doing it. When there's risk, when there's something that they lose, they're out of there. They're saying, I'm gone. You can go to the wolves as far as we're concerned. So the first reason we see here in verses 11 through 13 that Jesus sacrifices himself is that's the duty. That's his responsibility as the good shepherd. But Jesus, the Good Shepherd, does not sacrifice him simply out of cold, hard responsibility. Hey, this is the job, I got to do it. He also does it because of an intimate relationship he has with the sheep. Notice verse 14. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own. He does this because of this intimate, deep relationship he has with the sheep. Remember, back at the beginning of the chapter, the sheep know his voice. And he knows their names. He calls them. They know his call. They know his voice. Remember that hireling can't take the place of the shepherd because they won't listen to his voice. They only know the shepherd's voice. You see, Jesus acts sacrificially because he loves and intimately cares for his sheep. There is this mutual relationship. I know my sheep. I know who are mine. I know them intimately and personally. And they know me intimately and personally. They have some knowledge of who I am. They recognize me. And isn't that the reality? That, like I said, you can't pay me enough to go sacrifice my life. But if there's a cause, if someone's life is on the line, especially if someone I know and love's life is on the line, I'll do what I got to do, right? And so, even in little ways, we as parents know, everyone who's a parent knows, you sacrifice for those kids, don't you? You sacrifice time. You sacrifice energy. You moms especially sacrifice a lot of sleep, right? We sacrifice for those that we love. And so Jesus is saying, yes, I sacrifice for you because I love you. I care for you. But then Jesus says something interesting here in verse 15. He shifts this. And he says in verse 15, as the Father knows me, even so I know the Father. Well, wait a minute. He's now bringing up relationship with the Father. He seems to do that a lot in the Gospel of John, in these discourses. He does that pretty often. But why does he do it here? Why does he bring up his relationship with the Father? Well, he's making a comparison. Okay, just as the shepherd knows the sheep and vice versa, so the Father knows me and vice versa. Why does he bring this up, though? Just to say, hey, it's kind of like that? Well, there's some comparison, certainly. But I think what Jesus' point here is this. I love my sheep as the good shepherd. But the reason I love my sheep, the reason I have this relationship with the sheep, is because I have a relationship first with my Father. My first relationship is with God in heaven. So what we realize is Jesus is saying, the reason that I have this relationship, the reason that I have sheep, the reason that I sacrifice for them and I love them is because first I have a relationship with God. And this is the very same reality that is in our Christian life. We realize we cannot effectively love our family, our neighbors. We cannot really love genuinely without having a connection to God, without having a connection to the God who is love. Only when we know God and we love Him and He shows His love for us can we actually mimic that love and love as God loves. So Jesus is saying, yes, I love my sheep. I am in an intimate relationship with them, but that's not devoid. That's not disconnected from my relationship to God. In fact, it's grounded on my relationship with God. And he says, and I lay down my life for the sheep. The reason, his point is this, the reason I lay down my life for the sheep is because I know the love of God. Because I am intimately connected to God as well. And not only that, but this love also drives Jesus to not only love his own, but to invite and welcome others in to the flock. Notice verse 16. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice. And there will be one flock and one shepherd. That's kind of a strange thing to say here. Who are these other sheep of a different fold who are going to be welcomed in? Well, probably the best interpretation, and kind of I think what most people interpret this as, is to say he's speaking here to Jewish community. He's in Jerusalem. He knows who his sheep are. He knows who his followers are. He knows them personally. But he's looking ahead to a time when there's going to be other sheep that are welcomed in, that are different, that are not of Jewish descent, but are what they call Gentiles. What most all of us are. It's Gentiles. We don't have that Jewish background and ethnicity. And so his point here is to say the relationship that he has with his sheep, grounded in the relationship with the Father, this love welcomes in others. It crosses cultural, geographic barriers and brings others in. And certainly, by the time John the Apostle is writing this book, he has seen the inclusion of the Gentiles into the church through the ministry of Paul and whatnot in the book of Acts. And he realizes that Jesus was speaking of the church here. And this is, as far as I'm aware, this is like the first clear reference to the church in John's gospel. He's saying the church, this new body, is going to include not only people of this flock of the Jewish descent, but people of various kinds. God's love for his people is going to build this new flock, as it were, of mixed peoples, various kinds. God's love extends, and the sacrifice of Jesus affects not only certain groups, but it affects all peoples. So we've seen very clearly Jesus has given us two reasons already why he sacrifices. First of all, because it's his duty as the shepherd. Second of all, because he knows and loves his sheep. But we see the third reason in verse 17. In verse 17, he says, well, it's 17 to 18. He says, therefore my Father loves me because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. His point is this. I sacrifice myself for the sheep out of obedience and submission to the Father. So there in verse 17 he says, therefore my Father loves me. And this is causes us a question, okay, is it only because Jesus sacrifices himself that the Father loves him? And that certainly isn't the case. I think the point is this. He's simply saying, I show my love for the Father by sacrificing myself. Because I lay down my life. And because I display my love for the Father, he also loves me. It's this mutual thing. It's this mutual relationship of love. He loves me and I love him. And I show that by sacrificing myself. You see, Jesus longs to please his Father. He wants to please his Father. And so he does what is pleasing to his Father. Interesting, he says, because I lay down my life that I may take it again. This kind of helps answer that question. How is it that Jesus' death, the death of the shepherd, could help the sheep? Well, because this shepherd, when he dies at the hand of the wolf, he can take his life back again. And this is clearly a reference to resurrection. He can take his life back again, and he can once again shepherd and protect his sheep. But Jesus' obedience to the Father is not just out of a desire to please him, but it is out of his own free choice. Notice verse 18. No one takes it from me. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of myself. He says, don't misunderstand. When you see me on the cross, it's not because the powers of evil have won. It's not because Jesus got tripped up. Oh man, they caught me and I didn't think they would get me. Remember, multiple times in John's Gospel, in fact we're going to see here at the end of this chapter, at the end of John 8, and we see it in other Gospels as well, that the Jews pick up stones to stone Jesus, or they take him to a hill to throw him off and kill him, right? But what happens? Jesus always eludes them. Somehow, he gets away. Jesus, you're going to die anyway. Just let him take you. But it's not his hour yet. His time has not yet come. His sacrifice will be at his terms, at his timing, according to God's perfect plan. So he says, listen, when I die, it's not because the enemy's won. It's because I willingly give up my life. That's even so clear as we look at the cross itself. And Jesus gives up his spirit. He doesn't die at the hands of his enemies. He gives up his spirit. He allows himself to die. And he says this, I still have power. Even in my death, I have power. I have power to lay it down. That is my life. I have power to lay it down. I have power to take it again. I don't know about you, but we might say that some people can sacrifice their life, in terms, like I said, throwing yourself on the explosive, on the hand grenade. That's somewhat sense in which you're giving yourself to death. But I don't know of anybody that has the power then to take their life back after that. All but Jesus. Who gives life? God does. God gives life. And so this one, Jesus, is able to give his life, but he's also able to take it back again in the resurrection. And that's what he claims here. Yes, I can take my life back. And notice his closing statement in verse 18. This command I have received from my Father. I'm doing this in obedience, in submission to my Father. I want to do what my Father wants me to do. I don't know if you think about your relationship with your father. And obviously, as a child, you wanted to obey your father. But I find as I get older, I don't have this fear of obeying him or disobeying him. But I have this, desire to please him, to do the things that would make him happy. I want to please my Father even still. And that's the sense we get from Jesus. He wants to do what pleases the Father. And so he follows his plan perfectly. So what we see here is Jesus has laid out for us 3 reasons why he sacrifices himself. He does so because he is the good shepherd. He does so because it's his responsibility as the shepherd. He does so because he loves us with the love of God. And he does so because he is submitting to his Father's plan. Now, don't you think that might break down some of the barriers of these Jews to say, I want to follow that shepherd. I want someone who's going to lay down their life for me, who loves me intimately. Don't you think? Well, look at verse 19. We see basically the same thing we saw in chapter 7 and 8, and even a little bit in 9. Therefore there was a division among the Jews because of these sayings. And many of them said, remember Jews being the religious leaders, many of them said, he has a demon and is mad. Why do you listen to him? What? He's got a demon. They fall back on this. I think they realize that Jesus is kind of pointing to them as the bad leaders. And they said, we can't listen to him. We've already marked him off saying, no, just forget about anything he has to say. He is far out. And so they say, no, he's got a demon. Don't listen to him anymore. But then there are those who like again, I think sometimes of Nicodemus might be in this other crowd. Others said, these are not the words of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? In other words, this doesn't sound like a demon-possessed person. Besides the fact, remember, he just healed a man born blind. Demon-possessed people, the power of the demons doesn't give sight, it takes sight. So once again, it's the obvious implication is that this Jesus is not from demons, he is from God. Again, we see shocking unbelief among the Jews. But Jesus knows his own. Jesus, as he spoke, and he presented himself as the good shepherd, and he said, I know my own. He had in mind certain people. Certainly those who were present with him, right? His apostles. He knew Peter and John and James and Bartholomew, all these others, right? He knew each one personally. And he knew, of course he knew Judas, that he was going to betray him. And he also knew what would happen on the night of his arrest. That there's going to be a lot of those, in fact, almost all of his disciples would abandon him and leave him. He walked with those people and talked with those people. He knew their shortcomings. He was frustrated with them at times because they wouldn't understand. He was frustrated at their pridefulness. Jesus knew them just like he knows you and me. He knows all about you. He knows where you've been, what you've done. He knows the things that you're ashamed to even think about or talk about. He knows you, and he knows me intimately. But as Jesus stood there, and perhaps he was primarily thinking about his disciples and what a disappointment they had been at so many occasions and would be, Jesus still set his face to the cross. In spite of the shortcomings, the sinfulness of his sheep. He set himself to the cross to take the sins of his wayward sheep upon himself. Why did he do it? Did he do it to benefit himself? Hey, you get something great out of it? No, of course not. He did it simply to please his Father. Do you live your life to please God? In light of the sacrifice of Jesus that he has given for us, that he died to take our sins even though we're sinful and wicked people, does that compel you to want to live your life to please the Father just as Jesus did? What can you do in the light of such amazing grace but to simply submit yourself to that Savior and live to please the Father? Let's pray together.